circle of chairs creaked slightly as people shifted in their seats, the sound amplified in the quiet, dimly lit community center. The group was larger than usual, faces pale and drawn, their collective weight of sorrow palpable. It was a room of broken people, each carrying invisible burdens that threatened to crush them. Elliot sat slouched, his hands jammed into his jacket pockets. He stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, barely listening as the facilitator, Karen, introduced a guest speaker. She was always trying something new to spark hope in the group. A new activity, a new speaker, but it all blurred together in Elliot's mind. He'd stopped believing in hope a long time ago. When Abigail spoke, however, the room seemed to shift. Her voice was calm, lilting, and surprisingly commanding. Elliot glanced up, mildly curious despite himself. "Regret," she began, her sharp gaze sweeping across the room, "is a chain. A heavy one, forged link by link with every missed opportunity, every failure, every word left unsaid." Her hands, pale and slender, gestured as she spoke, weaving her words like a spell. Some of us carry so much regret that it defines us. It keeps us anchored in the past, unable to move forward. Elliot's chest tightened, and he fought the urge to get up and leave. He hated how much her words resonated, how they pierced the wall he'd built around his pain. He glanced around the circle and saw others sitting up straighter, their attention rapt. Abigail reached down to a small wooden box resting on the chair beside her. The box itself was unremarkable, its varnish faded and its hinges slightly tarnished, but when she opened it, a peculiar sense of anticipation rippled through the room. "Inside this box are trinkets," she said, lifting it so everyone could see, "objects waiting to hold your burdens. The exercise is simple. Choose one. Hold it. Focus on a specific regret and pour every memory, every feeling tied to that regret into it. Then for the next 24 hours, carry it with you. Feel its weight, and when you're ready, discard it, far from home." Several people exchanged wary glances, and someone shifted uncomfortably in their chair. Elliot remained still, his eyes fixed on the box. There was something unsettlingly magnetic about it, like it called to him specifically. Abigail's gaze landed on him, her dark eyes piercing yet strangely gentle. "What would it feel like," she asked, her voice softening, "to let go of just one regret, to walk without that chain?" Karen handed the box to the person closest to her, a woman clutching a tissue in her trembling hand. One by one, the box made its way around the circle, each person hesitating before reaching inside. When it reached Elliot, he stared at it for a long moment. His throat felt tight. The room seemed quieter than before, as though the air itself had stopped moving. Finally, he reached in and felt his fingers brush against a cold, metallic surface. He pulled out a small brass button, its edges worn smooth from age. It was nothing remarkable, yet it felt heavier than it should. As he turned it over in his palm, a strange clarity settled over him, a sharp and painful focus on the voicemail he hadn't returned, the call he'd ignored, and the funeral he'd barely made it through without falling apart. Abigail smiled faintly. "Hold on to that," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "You'll know what to do." The walk home from the community center was a blur for Elliot. The night air was cold, slicing through his jacket, but he barely noticed. His hand stayed buried in his pocket, clutching the brass button. The city around him moved in its usual rhythm, but it all seemed distant, like a scene behind thick glass. By the time he reached his apartment, the button's edges had left faint indentations in his palm. Elliot's apartment mirrored his inner turmoil. Canvases leaned haphazardly against the walls, half-finished paintings coated in dust. Tubes of oil paint sat uncapped on a desk strewn with unopened bills and empty coffee cups. The air inside was heavy, tinged with the faint scent of turpentine and neglect. He dropped his keys onto the cluttered counter and sank onto his sagging couch, his head in his hands. The brass button sat on the coffee table now, glaring up at him like an accusation. He stared at it, his chest tightening with the weight of its implied promise. Let go of one regret. Was it really possible? His thoughts churned, pulling him back to the last voicemail from his father. The memory was painfully clear, sharper now than it had been in years. He could hear his father's voice, strained, uncertain, asking if they could talk. "I know I've made mistakes," the voicemail had said, crackling faintly in his headphones, "but I want to try." Elliot had been too angry, too stubborn to call back. A week later, his father was gone, a sudden heart attack cutting off any chance of reconciliation. His jaw clenched as the emotions surged. Guilt, anger, sorrow. They pressed down on him until he couldn't breathe. He grabbed the button again, the cool metal biting into his palm. It was absurd, really, to think this small, worn object could carry something as massive as regret. Yet the longer he held it, the more it seemed to draw his anguish to the surface, as though the act of gripping it was pulling the venom from a wound. But even as the button worked its strange pull, dark thoughts lingered, insidious whispers at the back of his mind. He had thought about it before, how easy it would be to stop this endless ache, to put an end to the relentless cycle of regret and self-loathing. The balcony, just a few steps away, suddenly felt far too close, its sliding glass door reflecting a warped version of his face. For a moment, Elliot stared at it, his breathing shallow, the weight of possibility pressing down on him like a physical force. He stood, unsteady, his heart pounding in his ears. The air in the apartment seemed to constrict, growing thinner with every step he took toward the door. His fingers brushed the handle, cold and indifferent beneath his touch. What would it matter, really? A few moments of fear, then nothing. No more grief, no more emptiness, no more waking up to this hollow, suffocating life. But as he stood there, another thought broke through, a fragment of Abigail's voice from earlier that evening. What would it feel like to let go of just one regret? It echoed in his mind, gentle but persistent. He looked down at the brass button in his hand, its tarnished surface glinting faintly in the dim light. The exercise was absurd, ridiculous even, but it was something, a lifeline. He let the door handle slip from his grasp and backed away, the trembling in his hands growing more pronounced. His knees gave out, and he crumpled onto the floor, clutching the button like a talisman. Tears burned his eyes, spilling over in hot streams as the enormity of his pain surged once more. The temptation to give in still lingered, a shadow on the edge of his thoughts, but he forced himself to focus on the button instead. He pressed it against his forehead, as though it could somehow force clarity into his chaotic mind. Exhaustion crept in, heavy and unrelenting. His thoughts slowed, and the room seemed to fold in on itself. Still clutching the button, he curled into the couch, his body trembling. Sleep came in bursts, uneasy, shallow, and by the time the first pale strands of dawn began filtering through his blinds, Elliot felt more tired than he had the night before. But a strange compulsion had taken root, pulling him out of the apartment and into the streets before he could fully understand why. The city was hushed in the early morning light, suspended in that fleeting, ethereal moment before it woke. The air was cool, brushing against his face in a way that felt almost cleansing, though it did little to ease the tangle in his chest. He walked aimlessly at first, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, the faint ache of sleep deprivation humming at the edges of his mind. But when he reached the bridge, he realized he had been heading there all along. Elliot stood at the edge, his fingers curling around the cold metal of the railing. The brass button burned against his palm now, its once smooth surface feeling rougher, almost alive, as if it carried the weight of his thoughts. He turned it over in his hand, studying its worn edges, his mind replaying the sharp clarity of Abigail's words from the night before. What would it feel like to let go of just one regret? The question had seemed abstract, distant. Now it loomed over him with unbearable closeness. Letting go should have felt like relief, but standing there, staring at the river below, Elliot found himself hesitating. His grip tightened on the railing, his other hand clenching the button so hard it bit into his skin. A dark thought crept in, insidious and familiar. What if, instead of tossing the button, he let himself go? The river would catch him. It would be over quickly, the endless ache washed away along with everything else. He leaned forward slightly, the railing pressing into his stomach, his breath catching as the cold wind rushed up to meet him. And then, Abigail's voice resurfaced, cutting through the fog in his mind. "You'll know what to do." The memory of her gaze, steady and knowing, held him in place. Slowly, he pulled back from the edge. He swallowed hard and turned his attention to the object in his palm. With a trembling hand, Elliot raised the button to his lips and whispered the regret he had carried for years. the one that had carved a hollow space inside him. Then, before his resolve could falter, he hurled the button into the river with all the force he could muster. The splash was barely audible, swallowed by the rush of water below, but the moment the button disappeared, something shifted inside him. The weight in his chest lifted, not all at once but in fragments, like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. His breath came easier, his shoulders loosening, though the lightness felt wrong, unnatural, like the absence of something that should still be there. Elliot stayed there for a while, staring at the ripples as they smoothed into stillness. He should have felt relief, maybe even joy, but what coursed through him was harder to name, a muted emptiness, like the aftermath of a storm. Turning away from the water, he began the long walk home, his steps slower, the city awakening around him. When he reached his apartment, something gnawed at the edges of his mind, an absence he couldn't quite place. He sat on the couch, his gaze drifting to the spot where the button had rested the night before. It was gone, just like the regret he had poured into it. But as the morning stretched on, the edges of his father's voice in his memory began to blur, the tone and cadence slipping away, leaving behind only a vague sense of warmth and loss. Panic bloomed faintly in his chest. He reached for the memory again, harder this time, but it was like clutching at smoke. The ache of regret had vanished, but so had something vital, something that had once tethered him to who he was. The hours since that morning blurred together. He couldn't recall the specifics of arriving at work, whether he'd greeted anyone, exchanged pleasantries, or even eaten breakfast. Time moved differently now, like he was wading through shallow water, every motion slowed and muted. The tasks on his screen, budget spreadsheets and email threads, felt like they belonged to someone else's life. His fingers moved mechanically over the keyboard, inputting numbers that meant nothing to him, while the office around him buzzed with faint energy he could no longer connect to. Mark, a coworker from a few desks away, ambled over during one of the dull lulls in their shared workload. Mark was friendly enough, with a perpetually good-natured air that made his presence tolerable, even on bad days. Today, though, Elliot barely looked up when Mark leaned against his desk, a mug of coffee in hand. "Hey," Mark said, his voice light and conversational. "You doing okay? You've been looking tired, a bit stressed." Elliot blinked, unsure how to answer. The polite, automatic responses he might have used before didn't come to him, and he was left staring at Mark blankly until the silence grew awkward. Mark cleared his throat and pushed on. "Anyway, I meant to tell you, I was thinking about your dad earlier." He smiled faintly, a wistful expression crossing his face. "You know, he always had this way of lighting up a room. I'll never forget the time he came to that office barbecue a couple of years ago and told that story about, oh, what was it? Something about a fishing trip. It had everyone cracking up." Mark chuckled softly, his gaze distant as he remembered, but Elliot just stared at him, his brow furrowed. The story meant nothing to him. He couldn't recall the barbecue or the fishing trip, or even the warmth his father had brought to moments like those. All he could muster was a vague, shadowy awareness that he had once known these things, but the details were gone. Elliot forced a faint nod, muttered something non-committal, and turned back to his screen. Mark lingered for a moment, frowning slightly, before walking away. Once he was gone, Elliot reached for his wallet, pulling out the photo tucked into the worn leather sleeve. It was a snapshot of his father, taken years ago on a sunny day. In the picture, his father's face was bright with laughter, the edges of his eyes crinkled in joy. Elliot stared at it for a long moment, waiting for the familiar pang of grief or guilt to hit him. But there was nothing. No spark of recognition, no emotional pull, just a blank, dispassionate void. Slowly, methodically, he folded the photo in half, then in half again, and without a second thought, he dropped it into the small trash can under his desk and turned back to his computer. Elliot's days slid past like shadows on a wall, indistinct and fleeting. He went through the motions of work, sleep, and routine, but each act felt increasingly meaningless. His coworkers' faces blurred together, their small talk dissolving into static. At night, his apartment echoed with silence, the absence of his father's memory a wound he couldn't articulate. One afternoon, seated at his desk during lunch break, he opened his wallet to retrieve his credit card and paused. Behind the plastic sleeves and folded bills, another photo stared back at him. Lisa. Her face was lit with the glow of a summer afternoon. Her hair caught mid-motion in the wind. The picture was from years ago, when he still believed in the permanence of love, before he ruined things with his selfishness and inability to open up. He hadn't thought of her in weeks, perhaps longer. And yet now, the sight of her smile unleashed a torrent of feeling. He felt the ache bloom sharply, cutting through his numbness like glass. He thought of the fights they'd had, the moments he failed her, his refusal to confront the darkness inside himself when she begged him to talk. She had left because he wouldn't change, wouldn't let her in. The regret hit him hard, a pulse of bitterness and sorrow entwined. For the first time since releasing the button, he felt something close to clarity. A crack in the emotional stasis that had consumed him. But the clarity hurt. It overwhelmed him, choking his breath and tightening his chest. He pressed the photo against the desk with trembling hands, his vision blurring. The memory of her wasn't just pain, it was a reminder of who he used to be, someone still capable of loving and being loved. Now that person felt like a ghost. By the time Elliot returned home, the edges of the ache had sharpened into something unbearable. Lisa's image lingered in his thoughts. Her voice, her laugh, all of it felt like too much to hold. He paced his apartment restlessly, his hands twitching as he avoided looking at the dust-covered canvases leaning against the wall. The ache had to go. He couldn't live with it clawing at him like this. His hand brushed against his coat, still slung over the back of the couch. Without knowing why, he reached into the pocket and pulled out a tarnished coin. He didn't remember taking it from the box, and yet here it was, its cold surface rough against his skin. Perhaps he had retrieved it subconsciously in some desperate hope for another reprieve. The moment his fingers closed around it, he knew what to do. He sat down at the table, his hands clasping the coin as if in prayer. Focusing on Lisa's photo in front of him, he poured every memory of her into the metal, every fight, every embrace, every whispered promise. The next day, Elliot wandered aimlessly through the city, the coin tucked into his pocket like a lead weight. Each step carried with it the familiar haze of exhaustion, his mind clouded by the remnants of a restless night. By mid-afternoon, as he passed a narrow alley where a garbage truck rumbled to life, he knew it was time. Pausing at the edge of the street, he pulled the tarnished coin from his pocket. The object felt heavier than before, as if it had absorbed not just his thoughts, but the very essence of his connection to her. Without ceremony, he threw it into the truck's open maw, the clang of metal swallowed by the grinding machinery. The effect was immediate. The suffocating weight in his chest lifted, the pain evaporating like mist in sunlight. Relief rushed over him, cold and hollow, and with it came the familiar numbness that had followed the brass button. He reached for his wallet, withdrew Lisa's photo, and stared at her smile one last time. It stirred nothing. No pang of loss, no flicker of love, only a blank detachment. Ripping the photo into quarters, he dropped it into a nearby trash can, turned, and walked away, her face already fading from memory. The days bled together after Elliot discarded Lisa's coin. He moved through his routines with the mechanical precision of someone who no longer recognized himself. The faces of coworkers blurred, their voices reduced to murmurs. Even Mark, who had noticed something was wrong, no longer approached him. Elliot felt as if he existed behind a pane of frosted glass, present but unreachable. His evenings were no better. His apartment, a silent tomb of abandoned canvases and stifled potential, offered no refuge. He couldn't recall the last time he'd picked up a brush or even looked at the paintings he once poured his soul into. They seemed to belong to another life, another person entirely. After work, he wandered the city, the hours slipping past without meaning. By the time he reached his apartment, it was dark again, the city alive with muted vibrancy he could no longer connect to. Closing the door behind him, Elliot dropped his keys onto the counter and sat on the floor, his back against the couch. He felt heavy, like he was sinking. Somewhere in the chaos of his thoughts, a grim realization began to form. This emptiness wasn't an accident. It was spreading, devouring him piece by piece. Still, the compulsion remained. Even as his doubts grew, Elliot found himself returning to the ritual, as though it were a lifeline he couldn't release. He performed the ritual again and again, retrieving trinkets from somewhere he couldn't remember and discarding memories he could no longer recall. He cast a small, rusted compass into a fountain in the park, letting go of the regret of abandoning his art. He buried an old fountain pen under the roots of a tree, severing the guilt of betraying a childhood friend's trust. Each time, the ache in his chest subsided, but so too did something else. And with each release, the void expanded. The memories faded faster now, slipping from his grasp like water through cupped hands. His life became a sequence of detached moments, the connections between them unraveling into static. One night, staring at the walls of his apartment, Elliot realized he no longer remembered why he had started painting in the first place, or what it had felt like to create something meaningful. The world around him continued to move, but Elliot couldn't feel it. Friends, co-workers, and strangers alike became indistinguishable, their faces unremarkable, their voices an indistinct hum. He had erased so many regrets, untethered himself from so much pain, that he no longer knew what made him who he was. And, sitting alone in his apartment, for the first time the thought crept back in, the balcony was still there, just a few steps away. The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds of Elliot's apartment, its faint glow catching on the edge of the balcony door. The sight of it made his stomach tighten, but the pull that had nearly drawn him there the night before was, for now, dulled. He had sat awake for hours, frozen on the couch, the faint hum of traffic beyond the glass his only company. The tension hadn't left him entirely, but the desperate edge had receded. Something inside him had whispered that there was still another option, that he needed to go somewhere, speak to someone. By mid-morning, Elliot was standing outside the community center, staring at the faded lettering on the glass door. It had been a few weeks since he'd last attended the group session where Abigail had spoken, though he couldn't quite remember why he'd missed the subsequent meetings. His memory of that evening was vivid. Abigail's commanding voice, the strange box, the way her words had cut through the fog of his grief. It was the first time he had felt anything other than despair in months. Now, with the edges of that feeling fraying, he needed to hear her again, to understand what was happening to him. The familiar scent of stale coffee and cleaning supplies greeted him as he stepped inside, the door creaking softly behind him. The main hall was quiet, the rows of chairs neatly arranged in a circle, though there was no meeting scheduled at this time of day. Elliot's eyes scanned the room, searching for a face he recognized. Near the back, a woman with short, graying hair sat at a table, a half-empty mug of coffee beside her as she sorted through papers. It took him a moment to place her. Karen, the group facilitator. Elliot approached hesitantly, his footsteps muffled on the worn linoleum. Karen didn't look up at first, and when she did, her brow furrowed in faint confusion. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but uncertain. "It's me, Elliot," he said, shifting awkwardly on his feet. "I used to come here. A few weeks ago, I was at the meeting where Abigail spoke." Her frown deepened, and for a moment she simply stared at him, as if searching her memory. "Elliot," she repeated slowly, the name seeming unfamiliar on her tongue. "I'm sorry, it's been a long time. You used to come here years ago, didn't you?" She hesitated, as though unsure if she should say more. "I don't think I've seen you since then." "No, that's not right," Elliot said quickly, his pulse spiking. "I was here a few weeks ago. Abigail was the guest speaker. She had this wooden box, and she talked about letting go of regrets. I need to know if she's coming back." Karen's confusion deepened, her kind eyes studying him with concern. "Elliot, we haven't had a guest speaker in months, and I don't know anyone named Abigail," she said carefully. "Are you sure you're not thinking of somewhere else?" Elliot opened his mouth to respond, but his words faltered. His mind clung stubbornly to the memory of Abigail, the box, the ritual, but Karen's certainty made him feel as though the ground beneath him had shifted. "No," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now. "I'm not wrong. She was here." He trailed off, shaking his head. She said things that helped. Karen reached out, placing a hand lightly on the table between them. "I don't remember anyone like that," she said, her tone soft but firm. But if you're struggling, Elliot, we can talk. Or I can help you find someone who can help." "She's real," he interrupted, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. "She has to be." There was a pause, broken only by the distant sound of a mop bucket being wheeled across the hall. Karen's concerned gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she sighed. "I'm sorry, Elliot. I wish I could help, but I really don't know who you're talking about." From behind him, a gravelly voice cut through the quiet. "Did you say Abigail?" Elliot turned sharply, his eyes landing on the janitor, an older man in his 60s, leaning on a mop handle. His deeply lined face was set with a faint frown, his eyes sharp with thought. "I knew an Abigail," the man said, his words slow and deliberate. "Worked here a long time ago, 15, maybe 20 years back. But he hesitated, his gaze flickering to Karen before settling back on Elliot. "She died. Been gone a long time now." The air seemed to drain from the room, leaving Elliot cold and weightless. "What happened?" he managed, his voice barely audible. The janitor shrugged, a faint trace of discomfort crossing his features. "She was troubled, I guess you'd say. Heard she took her own life. They found her at her house, I think." He straightened as though to signal the conversation was over. "It's been years." Elliot's mind reeled, fragments of memory crashing into one another. Karen's voice reached him faintly, her concern evident, but he barely registered it. Abigail couldn't have died years ago. He had spoken to her. He remembered her. He stumbled back a step, gripping the edge of the table for support as the room spun around him. The janitor's words, Karen's confusion, they didn't fit. They couldn't fit. But as his breath quickened and the edges of his vision blurred, one unshakable thought rose to the surface. If Abigail was dead, then who or what had spoken to him? Elliot sat on the edge of his bed, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the frayed stitching of the blanket beneath him. The janitor's words rang incessantly in his mind. She's been gone a long time. The idea of Abigail being dead didn't make sense. He had spoken to her, held the box in his hands, followed her ritual. And yet Karen's confusion, her insistence that Abigail hadn't been there, made his certainty falter. By nightfall, Elliot felt like he was unraveling. He replayed the events over and over in his mind, trying to force clarity from the fragmented memories. He couldn't escape the sense that something critical was missing, that the sequence of events didn't quite add up. Sitting there, he realized he couldn't even remember the last time he had attended the community group before Abigail's visit. Weeks, months, no, longer. The gaps in his memory widened, opening into chasms that terrified him the more he stared into them. He stood abruptly, pacing the narrow length of his apartment like a caged animal. His mind felt splintered, memories shifting and reshaping with each step. Abigail's voice surfaced again, distant but vivid. "Regret is a chain," she had said, her words cutting through the static of his despair. The image of her standing before the circle of chairs flashed behind his eyes. But was it real? Or had his mind conjured her during one of his lowest moments? The more he thought about it, the more the memory felt wrong. A single fragmented recollection then rose to the surface with sudden and brilliant clarity. It was a night not long ago, when the weight of his father's death had resurfaced after an argument on the phone with Lisa, and it had all pressed down on him with unbearable force. He had stood at the edge of his balcony, staring into the void below, consumed by despair. That night, he had felt a presence, not in the room, but in his mind. Abigail had appeared to him then, or at least a version of her. She had spoken softly, her words imbued with strange comfort and power. What would it feel like to let go? She had asked. His breath caught in his throat. That night wasn't at the community center. It had been in his apartment, the darkness pressing against the windows like a suffocating fog. The vision of Abigail, the circle of chairs, even the box itself, all of it had been born from his mind, a desperate creation to pull him back from the edge. It hadn't been real, but if it wasn't real, how could the ritual work? How could he have discarded the button, the compass, the coin, and felt their weight lifted from his soul? Elliot slumped back in the chair, his chest tight. If the memory of Abigail wasn't real, then what was? He pressed his palms against his face, his thoughts spiraling. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet, insistent thought rose. If Abigail wasn't real, the box couldn't be either. But if the box doesn't exist, where have I been going to retrieve the trinkets? The cold wind stung Elliot's face as he walked, hands jammed deep into his pockets, head bowed against the biting chill. He didn't know exactly why his feet were carrying him in this direction, only that he felt a pull, an invisible thread guiding him. The neighborhood was unfamiliar. The buildings here seemed to lean inward, conspiring against the light, their facades smeared with grime and graffiti. It was a part of the city he had never needed to visit, one he wouldn't have sought out otherwise. And yet, as he turned down a narrow side street, he knew with certainty this was where he needed to be. He stopped in front of a house near the end of the block. Its windows were dark, their glass either shattered or obscured by warped plywood. The sagging roof and peeling paint gave it the look of something long forgotten. But as Elliot stood there, staring at the warped door and the overgrown yard, an uneasy familiarity clawed at him. He had no memory of this house, yet the knowledge that he had been here before hummed in the back of his mind, clear and undeniable. It wasn't a memory in the traditional sense, but a fact imprinted on him, as though someone had written it in the margins of his thoughts. He approached the house slowly. The closer he got, the more his pulse quickened, a thrum of anxiety and recognition rising with every step. He pushed lightly against the door, and it creaked open, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dampness and rot, the faint scent of mildew clinging to the walls. Dust swirled in the weak light spilling through the cracks in the boarded windows. The house felt alive in its silence, heavy with a presence he couldn't yet name. As Elliot stepped across the threshold, fragments of memory flickered in his mind. He saw himself moving through this space, his movements sluggish and unsteady, as though he had been sleepwalking. He saw his hand brushing the banister of the warped staircase, the wood damp and splintered beneath his fingers. He saw flashes of the basement, a dim space lit by the weak glow of a single bulb, and the image of a box resting on a cracked concrete floor. His breath hitched. The box. He had been here, retrieved the trinkets, and carried them away. Yet these recollections felt foreign, distant, like they belonged to someone else's life. His legs trembled as he gripped the banister now, feeling the splinters press into his palm. He knew where he had to go. The basement door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. As he descended the rickety steps, the memories grew sharper, clearer. He could see himself kneeling on the cold floor, reaching for the box with trembling hands, though the emotions tied to the axe had vanished, leaving only these hollow impressions behind. When he reached the bottom, his eyes found it immediately. The wooden box sat where he had seen it in his mind, its surface dull and scarred, its hinges rusted. As he crouched and placed his hands on the box, he expected it to feel unreal, like the mirage it had become in his mind. But it was solid. The texture of the wood beneath his fingertips was rough, worn smooth only in places where countless hands, including his own, had touched it before. He stared at it for a long moment, the air around him pressing down like a weight. He didn't need to open it to know it was real. The memories of this place weren't fabricated, and neither was the ritual. Elliot, a voice whispered behind him, soft but unmistakable. He froze, his hand still resting on the box. Slowly he turned. At first, the darkness at the edges of the room seemed to shift, gathering itself like smoke. Then, as his eyes adjusted, she stepped forward, her form both luminous and fractured. Abigail stood before him, her anachronistic clothing blending with the shadows, her face pale and distant, like a portrait fading with time. "I wondered if you would ever find your way here awake." He sat frozen as her spectral form wavered in the shadows, neither fully there nor absent. The moments stretched taut, the quiet punctuated only by the faint creak of the house settling above them. Finally, Abigail stepped closer, her heels making no sound against the cracked concrete. Her expression was distant, heavy with the weight of something unspoken, her dark eyes fixed on him with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "You've come further than I thought you would," she said, her voice soft, almost tender. "I feared you would succumb to your despair, but you are strong, stronger than I." Elliot swallowed, his throat dry, his mind racing. "You're dead," he said hoarsely, the words awkward on his tongue. "But I saw you. You were real. At the meeting, at the community center, you showed me the ritual. You gave me this." He motioned toward the box, his grip tightening on its edges, knowing he had never really seen her at the community center, but needing to hear it from her. Abigail's smile was faint and tinged with sadness. "I was once real," she admitted. "But I think, deep down, you already knew something wasn't right. That's why you're here, isn't it? To understand." Elliot's knuckles whitened around the box. He wanted to deny it, to cling to the fantasy of her as the guiding, enigmatic figure who had offered him a lifeline. But the house itself felt like a tomb, and every creak of its walls whispered truths he didn't want to face. "Why me?" he asked finally. "Why did you show me the ritual? Why did you help?" Abigail exhaled, though the sound was more like the faint rustling of leaves than breath. Her gaze dropped to the box in his hands. "Because I saw myself in you," she said after a pause, her voice quiet. "The pain, the weight of it, the way it presses down until you feel like you can't move, can't breathe." Her gaze met his again. "I thought if I could ease your suffering, maybe it would make mine mean something. You were already so close to giving up, I didn't think I could make it any worse." The words hung in the damp air, sinking into the silence that followed. Elliot leaned forward slightly, his pulse hammering in his ears. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice low, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Abigail took another step toward him, her silhouette flickering like an old film reel. "I used the ritual too much," she said simply. "At first it was just small regrets, petty things, arguments, embarrassments. But then I started reaching for more, deeper regrets, bigger burdens. It worked. Every time, the weight lifted, the pain faded." Her hand passed over the box as if to gesture toward it, though her fingers barely seemed to graze the air. But every regret carries something with it, a memory, a feeling, a piece of yourself. Her lips pressed together, her expression tightening. By the time I realized what I was losing, there was nothing left. No tether, no anchor, just a void. Elliot's breath caught as her words settled over him like a shroud. "And then what?" he pressed. "And then I couldn't take the emptiness anymore," she said softly, her tone devoid of self-pity. "I left this world the only way I could. But what came after wasn't peace. I became tied to this house, tied to the ritual, tied to people like you." Her voice faltered, a flicker of regret breaking through her composure. "I never wanted to lead you here, Elliot. I hoped you'd see the danger, that you would use it just enough to ease your pain and stop before it was too late." Elliot's grip slackened on the box, his arms trembling. "But I didn't stop," he murmured, staring at the worn surface of the wood. "And now I'm losing myself." Abigail stepped closer, her presence growing heavier, though her face softened with something like compassion. "It's not too late," she said. "You've gone further than I hoped, but you can still hold on to what's left. If you stop now, you can find your way back." Her voice dropped to a whisper, so quiet it barely reached him. "But only if you choose to stop." The basement dissolved around Elliot, the damp air and cracked concrete floor fading into an otherworldly haze. He stumbled, disoriented, as the edges of reality blurred, the wooden box slipping from his hands and vanishing into the void beneath him. A chill settled over his skin, not the ordinary cold of the physical world, but something deeper, like the absence of warmth itself. When he lifted his gaze, he found himself standing in a vast expanse, a surreal, shifting landscape that mirrored his fractured psyche. The sky above was a swirling canvas of storm gray and gold, its light neither day nor night but something in between. Beneath his feet, the ground was fragmented, a mosaic of jagged tiles, each reflecting faint impressions of memories he could no longer fully recall. Faces flickered in the shards, his father's, Lisa's, even his own. Some tiles were dull and cracked, others glowing faintly, like they were on the verge of fading altogether. The horizon stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of shifting shapes that refused to settle. It was a place both familiar and alien, as if built from the pieces of a life he no longer recognized. Elliot turned sharply at the sound of footsteps. Abigail stood a few feet away, her spectral form even more unsteady here, parts of her vanishing and reappearing with each moment. The calm she had carried in the real world was gone, replaced by an intensity that made her presence feel heavier, almost suffocating. In her hands, she held the brass button he had thrown into the river. Its tarnished surface gleamed, unnaturally bright against the dull haze around them. "You've reached the crossroads," Abigail said, her voice layered with an echo that rippled through the surreal space. Her dark eyes bore into his, her expression unreadable. "It's time to choose." Elliot swallowed, his throat dry. "Choose what?" he asked, though some part of him already knew. Abigail stepped closer, holding the button out to him. "You can take it back," she said, her voice soft but firm. "All of it, the regrets, the pain, the memories you erased, every choice you've tried to undo. It will be yours again, but there's a cost. You'll lose the ability to form new connections, new experiences. The future will always feel distant, unreachable. You'll carry your past like an anchor." Elliot's heart pounded as her words sank in. He glanced down at the fragmented ground, the reflections of his father's face shimmering faintly in one tile. "And if I don't?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Abigail's gaze softened, though her form flickered more erratically. "If you leave the regrets behind," she said, "you'll be free of the pain, but your old life will remain lost. You'll never get back what you've erased. The person you were is gone, Elliot. All you can do is move forward and rebuild." The enormity of the decision pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He thought of his father's voice, now faint and fragmented in his mind, and of Lisa's laugh, which had once filled him with warmth but now felt like a distant echo. The ache of losing them, of losing himself, clawed at his chest, but he forced himself to meet Abigail's gaze. "I don't want to be chained to the past anymore," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I'll leave it behind." Abigail nodded, her expression tinged with sadness and relief. She let the brass button fall from her hand, and it dissolved before it hit the ground. "Then go," she said, her voice fading as her form began to unravel into the air. "Rebuild, Elliot, and don't forget, regret is part of living. Don't run from it." As she disappeared, the fragmented world around him shattered, and Elliot was once more alone in the dark basement. Elliot woke to the dim light of late morning filtering through his blinds. He sat up slowly, his muscles stiff, as though the days since his decision had settled into his bones. A week had passed since the strange, fractured confrontation in the basement, since he had chosen to leave his regrets behind and step forward into a life unmoored from the weight of his past. The apartment was almost unrecognizable. Where there had once been chaos, dusty canvases leaning haphazardly against walls, clothes tossed carelessly over furniture, there was now an unsettling order. The floors were swept, the counters cleared, the clutter packed neatly into boxes he'd pushed into the corner of the closet. The walls, stripped of paintings, felt bare and unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone else's home. Elliot moved through the space as though it were a waiting room, devoid of personality and memory. He wandered to the small folding table that now served as his dining area. His morning coffee sat half-finished beside an empty notebook and a pen. Days ago, he had sat in that same spot, staring at the blank page, willing himself to write something, anything, that would tether him to this new version of himself. But the words hadn't come, and the silence of the room had grown louder, oppressive. He had closed the notebook, left the pen untouched, and retreated to the couch, letting the hours slip past. Today, though, the stillness felt sharper, pressing against his chest like an iron weight. He tried to escape it by pacing the length of the apartment, but his footsteps only echoed hollowly in the empty rooms. His gaze fell on the far corner where a single canvas rested on an easel, its surface blank. He hadn't touched his paint since the night he had discarded the rusted compass that held the regret of abandoning his art. The thought of painting felt foreign, almost alien now, as if it were a skill he had only read about, not one he had lived. He approached the easel anyway, running his fingers along the edges of the wooden frame. The texture was familiar, comforting in a distant way, but when he picked up a brush, his hand hesitated. The act of creation, something that had once been as natural as breathing, felt hollow. The passion was gone, the spark dulled to an ember he couldn't reignite. Setting the brush aside, Elliot let out a shaky breath and turned away from the canvas. His eyes landed on the small mirror hanging near the front door. For a long moment, he studied his reflection. The man staring back at him looked healthier, calmer even, but there was a vacancy behind his eyes that unsettled him. He felt unmoored, drifting between the person he had been and the person he could become. unsure of where to anchor himself. For the first time, a new regret began to take shape, not the regrets he had left behind, but the absence of them, the hollow space where they had once lived. He regretted losing his father's voice, Lisa's laugh, and the raw, imperfect parts of himself tied to those memories. Without them, he didn't know who he was. That thought lingered with him throughout the day, gnawing at the edges of his mind. By the time the sun began to set, Elliot felt the faint stirrings of resolve take root. The regret wasn't something to be erased, it was something to be faced, something that could guide him forward. He wouldn't paint tonight, he wouldn't write either. But he would start with something small, something that felt tangible and real. He reached for his laptop and began to research volunteering opportunities, his fingers moving hesitantly across the keyboard. As the hours passed, he read about support lines, mental health organizations, and counseling programs, feeling a faint but persistent pull. Perhaps he could take the hollow ache left by his regrets and use it to help others navigate their own. It wasn't art, and it wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step. And for now, that was enough. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the quiet office as Elliot leaned back in his chair, cradling a steaming cup of tea between his hands. It was late, nearing the end of his shift at the crisis helpline. Volunteering here had been an unexpected but grounding step. At first, the idea of listening to strangers pour out their pain had terrified him, but he had quickly found a strange solace in it. Each call was a reminder that others carried their own burdens, their own scars. It was a kind of mirror, reflecting his own struggles back at him, but from a distance, enough to give him perspective. Tonight had been quieter than usual, the kind of slow evening that let thoughts creep in unbidden. He'd thought of his father earlier, or the idea of him at least. The edges of the memory were still faint and elusive. He'd thought of Lisa, too, of the times they must have enjoyed together, but which he would never remember. These thoughts didn't consume him as they once had, but they lingered, a soft undercurrent that reminded him of the cost of the choices he'd made. He didn't resist them anymore. Instead, he let them pass through him like tides. The phone rang, breaking the stillness of the room. Elliot set his cup down and straightened, reaching for the headset. The line clicked open, and a hesitant voice greeted him, shaky and strained. "Hello?" the caller began, their words trembling. I don't really know why I'm calling, I just don't know what to do anymore." Elliot's voice was calm, steady. "Take your time," he said gently. "I'm here to listen." The caller hesitated, then began to speak in halting sentences, each word heavy with emotion. They recounted a recent loss, a mistake they couldn't take back, a moment they wished they could erase. "I can't stop thinking about what happened," they confessed, their voice cracking. "I can't bury it. It keeps coming back. I just wish I could make it all go away." Elliot closed his eyes for a moment, the words striking a chord deep within him. He knew that feeling all too well, but he also understood the danger of running from it. He let a beat of silence pass before speaking. "Regret is painful," he said softly, leaning forward. "But it's also a teacher. It shows us what matters, what we value. I used to think I could escape it, erase it, but I learned the hard way that doing that only takes more from you. If you try to make it all go away, you lose the lessons it can teach you." He paused, letting the words settle. "The pain is hard, but it's part of healing. It doesn't define you, it guides you." The caller was silent for a long time. Elliot could hear their shallow breathing on the other end of the line, the faint sound of muffled sobs. Finally, they whispered, "Do you really think I can move forward, even with everything I've done?" "Yes," Elliot said firmly, his voice steady and certain. "It won't happen all at once, but you can. You just have to take it one step at a time. Don't run from what you're feeling. Face it. Let it remind you of what you care about, and let that guide you forward." When the call ended, Elliot sat back in his chair, the faint hum of the office filling the silence again. He felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing he had helped someone take their first step. He had a purpose, rooted not in forgetting the past, but in helping others navigate their own. Elliot's shoes scraped against the uneven sidewalk, his pace slow but deliberate. The weight of the laptop bag slung over his shoulder was steady, grounding, as though it reminded him of why he was here. He had taken the day off from the helpline, a rare indulgence, but he knew he couldn't let this moment pass. The cemetery wasn't far now, but first there was somewhere else he had to visit. The bridge came into view, its iron railings gleaming faintly with dew. Elliot stopped at its edge, his hands slipping into his coat pockets as he stared down at the water below. The memory of that night returned with startling clarity, the brass button in his palm, the overwhelming ache in his chest, the desperate hope that the ritual would save him. He could still feel the weight of it, how it had seemed to pull not just his regret, but his very soul into the river. But now, standing there again, Elliot felt something quieter, a knowing. He had been chasing peace, running from his past, and in doing so, he had traded pieces of himself, precious, irreplaceable fragments of who he had been. And yet, the regrets that followed had taught him something deeper. The hollow ache he had carried since Abigail's ritual hadn't been a failure. It had been a guide, pointing him towards something he hadn't understood before, the value of holding on, even to the things that hurt. A cold breeze swept over the bridge, ruffling his hair and cutting through his coat. He tightened his grip on the strap of his bag and turned, leaving the bridge behind. The cemetery was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city where the trees grew tall and close together. When he stepped through the wrought iron gates, the air shifted, cooler, quieter, as though the world itself paused here. The path beneath his feet was gravel, crunching softly as he followed it past rows of headstones. He found Abigail's grave near the back, beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree. The headstone was modest, the name etched in plain, unadorned letters. Abigail Lane, 1973 to 2005. The words beneath it caught his eye. May you find the peace that eluded you in life. Elliot knelt on the grass, setting his bag beside him. He took out the laptop and opened it, the screen casting a pale glow on his face. Over the last month, in the quiet hours between calls at the helpline, he had pieced together fragments of Abigail's life. Public records, newspaper clippings, the whispered recollections of the janitor at the community center. It wasn't much, but it was enough to form a picture. He cleared his throat, his voice breaking slightly in the still air. "So, Abigail," he began, his words slow and careful. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I wanted to give you something back. The things you forgot, the things you left behind." His voice softened as he began to read. A list of moments, facts, and fragments spilled into the quiet. Her first job at a small-town library. A note about a friend she had lost touch with, whom she had described in an old letter as her other half. A regret she must have carried, leaving her mother's side the night she passed away, because the pain had been too much. Elliot's tone wasn't mournful, but gentle, his words wrapping around each detail with care. He didn't judge her flaws or failures, he honored them. These were the pieces she had used the ritual to erase, the fragments that had made her who she was. He hoped, wherever she was, that she could feel them now, and understand that they mattered. Understand that she mattered. As he finished, his voice faltered. The wind whispered through the oak's branches above, carrying away the last of his words. He shut the laptop and sat there for a long moment, the weight in his chest lighter than it had been in years. "Rest now," he said, "and thank you."